Hello and welcome back, everyone. This Buffs and Debuffs Breakdown has been a heck of a trip, but it's almost done. This final video is going to cover some of the most fiddly little aspects of Raid. Effects. They're like buffs or debuffs, kind of, except they happen instantly, and some of them have some very unusual interactions. Let's get into it. Speaking of straightforward, this effect is quite simple. A fair number of champions have the ability to remove buffs from enemy champions or debuffs from their own teammates. This ability is extremely useful. It doesn't work on protected buffs and debuffs. Well, it works on your protected buffs and debuffs, but you don't often try to remove your own buffs or remove your debuffs from the enemy. What are protected buffs and debuffs? We'll get into that later. So, that's the most basic form of messing with buffs and debuffs, getting rid of them. But there's more stuff you can do. Stealing a buff shifts a buff from the enemy onto you. It brings its duration along for the ride. This effect isn't a debuff, so it can't be blocked with block debuffs. That buff can actually get stolen, but it can be resisted. Transferring a debuff is the same as stealing a buff, but in reverse. You take your nasty debuffs and you foist them off on an enemy champion. It's not automatic. If you try to transfer a debuff onto a champion, they get a resistance check against your accuracy. And it is your accuracy when you're transferring a debuff, even if that debuff originally came from the target you're transferring the debuff to. There are actually a few champions that have passives that automatically transfer debuffs back to the sender. It might look quick when that happens, the debuff bouncing off the target back to the caster, but the debuff does actually land briefly. It can't stop the transfer, of course, even if the debuff is stun, fear, or freeze. That also means that if you have block debuffs on, or you have high resistance and the enemy has low accuracy, you can't do an instant transfer like that. All the enemy's incoming debuffs will fizzle before they land, so you can't send them back. In the same way, if the champion you're trying to transfer your debuff to has block debuffs, or you fail your accuracy test and they resist it, the debuff will never arrive, but you'll still get rid of it, so it becomes something more like remove debuff. Still powerful. Oh, and you can't transfer protected debuffs. Alright, we should probably talk about what protected buffs and debuffs are. You might have noticed that some buffs and debuffs get a very fancy yellow border. What's up with that? Well, that marks that a buff or debuff is protected. Protected buffs can't be removed or stolen by enemy champions, nor can they have their durations decreased or increased by the other team. Basically, a protected buff ignores any of your enemy's attempts to fiddle with it, though it can be blocked entirely if your target has a block buff's debuff on them. Protected debuffs are the same deal. The enemy team can't remove or transfer the debuff or decrease its duration. As we mentioned earlier, though, you can remove your own protected buffs and debuffs even if the enemy can't. Watch for skills that remove your own buffs or debuffs and make sure they're worth it. There are some special protected buffs and debuffs that are completely immune to not just the enemy team's influence, but your own as well. That means you can't modify their duration in your favor, but it also means you can't accidentally remove them with another skill. These are called fully protected buffs or debuffs. They don't look any different from regular protected buffs or debuffs, so you'll have to check the skill descriptions. Okay, that interlude out of the way, we should talk about the other method for shifting around debuffs. Instead of transferring a debuff from your champion to an enemy champion, it's also possible to bounce a debuff directly back at the caster. No transfer necessary. This is called Deflect Debuff. When you deflect a debuff, the target of the debuff instantly switches. There's no resistance check. The caster just debuffs themselves instantly. This effect even works on protected debuffs. The target changes instantly, so you can return them to sender, no problem. The enemy can't even remove the debuff that way. Deflected debuffs can still be blocked though, so if the enemy has block debuffs, then the debuffs that you're deflecting back at them will just fizzle out and vanish. However, unlike transfer debuffs, you can have block debuffs on yourself and still deflect debuffs. The debuffs are deflected before checking for block debuffs. This is pretty straightforward. Increasing duration makes the buff or debuff last a turn longer, while decreasing the duration makes it last one fewer turn, potentially ending the buff or debuff immediately. This still isn't a debuff, so it can't be blocked, but this effect can be resisted. Block Revive kind of sits between debuff and effect since it is a debuff, but it doesn't really act like one. What it does is straightforward. Champions with Block Revive can't be revived, end of story. Unlike all other debuffs though, you can only apply Block Revive by killing an enemy champion using a skill that applies the debuff. It takes good timing. Also, unlike other debuffs, Block Revive can't be blocked or resisted, and you can't even see it because the champion's dead. It can't be removed, and it never wears off. Once you put out a Block Revive, that champion's not coming back. Here's a weird one. Some skills in the Destroy Artifact set lets you not just damage the enemy's HP, but degrade their max HP for the rest of the battle. This can be really handy if you're up against a stubborn set of healers or the enemy likes to use revive abilities. However, it really does reduce the enemy's max HP. So if you have attacks that scale on enemy max HP, those skills will deal gradually less and less damage as their max HP gets lower and lower. Same goes for poison and HP burn debuffs. You're doubtlessly familiar with this one. A fair number of champions can boost their allies' turn meters, letting them take a turn sooner. Or they can drain the enemy's turn meters, letting your slower champions get ahead. If you don't know what turn meters are, check out our turn meters video. This effect can be resisted, and there are also a few restrictions on how this whole process works. First, champions can increase their own turn meters and do so all the time. They reduce their turn meters to 0% at the start of their turns, so any turn meter boost they use on their turn will go towards preparing them for their next turn. Second, there's a difference between reducing a turn meter by 100% and depleting a turn meter. A champion at 150% turn meter will go to 50% if reduced by 100%, but go to 0% if depleted. Third, as mentioned in our turn meters episode, a turn meter can't be reduced below 0. So, someone hitting a champion at 70% turn meter with a skill that reduces the turn meter by 100% will just reduce it to 0%. The extra 30% reduction is ignored. Fourth, when you steal someone's turn meter, the amount of your turn meter filled is equal to the amount you actually stole, not the amount you tried to steal. If a skill that steals 50% turn meter hits a target with only 30% of their meter filled, you only get 30% turn meter for yourself. Speaking of our turn meter episode, we actually made a mistake. In that episode of Raid 101, we said you couldn't increase a champion's turn meter if it was already above 100%. You could use increased speed, but direct increases didn't work. This is just not true. Sorry about that. It works just fine. We were completely wrong. Okay, that's that. Whew. That was a lot of ground to cover, but you did it! Buffs, debuffs, and effects might only seem like a part of Raid, but as you can see, they're a very big part. We hope you enjoyed this injection of pure raiding knowledge, and you'll join us again next time. Be sure to like and subscribe if you want more awesome Raid content.